going to hit the record button because we're going to record this and put this onto our YouTube channel as well. So hello, Cynthia. Hello, Faith. How are you?
Good.
Hello.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Oh, so glad to have you both. And I can't wait for this conversation. I'm going to fill a little bit of airtime, give Facebook just a little minute to notify everybody that we're live and that we're here. Warwick's is located in La Jolla, San Diego, California. Cynthia, you are joining us from, you said Florida, correct?
Gainesville, Florida. Yes.
And Faith, where are you joining us from?
Berkeley, California.
Okay, so we've got both coasts covered. Hopefully we'll get some people calling in or watching in from somewhere in the middle of the coast.
We've got some college towns covered.
Good, awesome. So a little bit about Warwick. You'll see my sign right there. It says since 1896. We are celebrating our 125th anniversary this year. So Nancy Warwick is the fourth generation owner of Warwick. So those of you that may not be in the San Diego area and not familiar with us, a little bit of history. Got some great things planned for later in the year. So if you're not on our email list, pop on that. We're going to have some trivia contests for you to win some gift cards and all kinds of fun stuff. For today's event, we're live on Facebook right now. If you're watching it on YouTube later, we won't be able to take any of your live comments there, but you'll have a great conversation to watch. But if you're on Facebook with us, and in that comment section, I'm going to be putting a copy of Cynthia's book, The Sound of the Sea. And you can easily click on that. You have two options there. If you're in the San Diego area and you want to come to the store to pick it up, we'd love to see you. Lots of other fun things to look at the store, or click ship it to your home. I always like to say any way there is to get a book, you can get it from Warwick's. We actually can ship. And so can all your other independent bookstores. So if you have one that you'd like to support close to your home, please do that. Cynthia and Faith are going to chat today for about 35 minutes. And I will be bringing in any comments that you have or questions. Go ahead and put those into the comment section of Facebook. I'll bring those into them after they're done chatting. So with that, I'm going to introduce you two ladies and then we'll start the conversation. So Cynthia Barnett is the author of three previous books, including Rain, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and named a finalist for the Penn E.O. Wilson Award for Literary Science Writing. She lives with her family in, like we said, Gainesville, Florida, where she is an environmental journalist in residence at the University of Florida. She is here today to talk to us about her latest book, The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans. Joining her today is Dr. Faith Kearns. Dr. Kearns is a scientist and science communication practitioner who writes about water, wildfire, climate change, and people. Her work has been published in New Republic, On Being, Bay Nature, and more. Her new book, Getting to the Heart of Science Communication, and I'll pop that into the comment section too, A Guide to Engagement, has been lauded for its fresh approach to engaging communities in science. Cynthia and Faith will talk about their efforts to reach audiences on touch issues such as wildfire and climate change. With that, ladies, have a great conversation, and we'll see you in about a half hour.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Julie, and thanks for having us at Warwick's. I only wish we could all be together in person, but it's great to see you, Faith. We talk on Twitter and we talk on email and sometimes on the phone. So it's really nice to see you on the screen.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you as well, Cynthia. I first just kind of want to extend a heartfelt congratulations to you for this wonderful book, The Sound of the Sea, which really is getting so much well-earned appreciation from reviewers. It was just such an enjoyable read, and I learned so much while I was reading it, but it was so enjoyable that I hardly noticed that I was learning. And I was also just so in awe of the craft, really, that I think it took to write a book that kind of spanned time and space in the way that it does, and just had so many beautiful sentences and paragraphs. I was just really in awe of the writing. So thank you so much for writing this very beautiful book.
Ah, nice to see it there in Berkeley. Thank you. And the book took me 6 years. You know, it's funny. I thought this would be my easiest book because it's about seashells, right? So I had been writing about water for so many years, which was a complex topic to learn about over the years, and learning about the water cycle and then the atmosphere And I thought it would be a bit easier to write about seashells. And boy, was I wrong about that. This was my most challenging book, and it took me the longest in terms of the number of years it took me to write it. It took me every bit of 6 years.
I mean, in a certain way, I can understand why, just the time scale alone that you were dealing with in terms of, evolution and shells and biomineralization to
Yes.
sort of the present day is in and of itself an enormous undertaking. And so I think I want to start by kind of asking you about a theme that runs throughout the book, which is in so many ways a book about listening. So there's a lot about listening to shells, listening to the sea, listening to people's sort of untold and unheard stories, and listening to what the ocean is telling us about climate change. So in particular, I was really struck by this story of a researcher named Miriam Kohler. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her last name right, but she's this woman who's a researcher who's the daughter of liturgical musicians who ended up with this kind of musical obsession of her own of sorts. Can you talk a little bit about her work listening to shells?
Sure. I mean, that is a fascinating story. So you're talking about the chapter that's all about shell trumpets. And I should back up. First of all, Faith, I want to thank you so much for being here and interviewing me. And I want to congratulate you on your book. I want to make sure that everyone in the audience knows who you are. Dr. Kearns has written an amazing book called Getting to the Heart of Science Communication. And the neat thing about us being in conversation today is that her book too is a lot about listening. So it's more on the science and science communication practitioner's side, whereas my audience, the audience I was thinking about, was very much for the general public, but we're both thinking very keenly about listening. And so I love that theme. And from the beginning, I thought of seashells as, a great metaphor for listening to the earth, listening to science, listening to nature. As you said, listening to unheard voices, listening to women in science and in other realms who had been unheard in some of this scientific history. And so you've asked me about a really specific part of the sound and the listening. And this was quite fascinating. I'll also say I never expected to learn this much about sound from animals that are silent. For the most part, mollusks are silent. And one reason for that, from an evolutionary standpoint, is that they are so slow moving that they can't make a racket. They can't call attention to themselves because it would be easier for their predators to find them. But they have that life when they're silent, and then they have an afterlife where for all of human history and pre-human history, that afterlife has included shell trumpets, and they have been, just a beautiful part of human culture. They've often been a little bit of a disturbing part of human culture, and that was sort of the case in the story you're talking about in Chavin, in what is now the Peruvian Andes. I wrote about a group of scientists, first of all, the archaeologists who found this incredible cache of shell trumpets that hadn't been played in 4,000 years, and they were buried underneath this temple. And the scientist who Faith is asking me about is a woman who does psychoacoustics, and her name is Dr. Miriam Kohler. And she was at Stanford at the time as a postdoc, and I believe she's at Amherst now. I believe she had moved on after I interviewed her. But her work was all about what those shell trumpets might have sounded like in their space. And she was able to figure out that the priests of Chavin had built their temple in such a way that it would look like their oracle was speaking when the conch horn sounded. And it was almost like Wizard of Oz sound effects. And they were really, really intentional. And so she works on not only the acoustic science, but the psychology of it. How would it have made people feel to be in those, the rooms are small, they're dark, they have other special effects. How would that have made people feel? And so it was a really moving chapter to work on when we were also going through that moment of incredible propaganda in our own country, and it was the fake news cries were going on at that time. And that chapter just felt so real to me and so close, even though it had happened 4,000 years ago, that those trumpets were being played, because in all parts of history, we've had we've used propaganda, and we've used different ways of public manipulation, which is, some of the stuff that you and I try to battle. So in every way, listening to seashells helped me tell a story. And so I built the book around 12 iconic seashells to humanity that would help me tell a story of not only the science of what's happening to the world around us, but the human foibles and the human innovations that will, hopefully lead the way out. So they very much became a symbol of listening.
Yeah, I mean, it was really fascinating from the very beginning to, reflect on my own and everybody's fascination with shells, right? As you sort of say in the book, everybody's got these shell collections. And unbeknownst to my brother, just a couple days before that, he had been telling me how every closet in our house in a very landlocked Arizona, if you open it, there's a bag of shells, at least one.
You're kidding.
No, and it was actually a very just coincidental comment where, I was reading your book at the same time and just reflecting on, how many times have I collected shells, and where are they, and what have I done with them? And,
yes.
And just thinking about that, like that every household is probably filled with some assortment of shells, no matter where we are, right?
Yes. Yes. So that was what I was thinking as I was conceiving this book. I was thinking of my own life with shells, which is a bit more obvious because I grew up in Florida and California, but I was convinced that there are inland homes all over the world, in Mumbai and in Michigan, that are just stashed with little shell stashes. And a lot of it has to do with just picking up natural objects on vacation. And I think these are among the most beloved objects in nature even now. And surely in my house, I have that scene in the introduction where I've got little stashes of shells that I can't throw away because they were collected by small hands. And then sure enough, when I finished the book, I got this crazy package in the mail from my mom, and it was all wrapped up, and it was, literal shells that I had collected with my grandmother. And now that's funny. Now they're being mailed across the country, which is pretty hysterical. But yes, we love seashells, and that's why I decided to write this book, because I saw them as a touchstone. Your book is really about getting to the heart of science communication, but when I read your book, I was also thinking of your book as getting to hearts, because we know, even from communication science, we know that it's not facts and data that move people. It is their touchstones and the things that touch their hearts.
Yeah, I mean, the book was, even though it is, you're a environmental journalist, a science writer, the book was very much filled with feeling. And that was, that was present from the first pages, just this very strong sense of feeling across time that that most people have for shells. And so, I was just wondering about how you kind of married those two things, the sort of the head and the heart of talking about how shells are formed, which is a pretty intensely biological chemical process,
Mhm.
which you describe in great detail. But also, the thing that really comes across is how much people love shells. And so those two things were really wedded, I think, nicely throughout your book.
I think that's why it took 6 years. Yes, and I will tell you that the evolutionary piece was the most difficult, and that needed to be to me, mentally, that needed to be really early on in the book. And that was tough because, you've got to explain 500 million years of evolution and keep people reading. And that was really hard. And in fact, I explained much more than that, because when I started out, I wanted to know, but wait a minute, where did the first shells come from? Like, I wanted to go back before mollusks and figure out what was the first being ever to make a shell. And that's how I ended up writing about Phoebe Cohen, a geologist who I think we both follow on Twitter, and she's really interesting to follow. And so it was by telling human stories. So I would tell the story of her microfossils, but I told it through her research that followed another woman's research from the generation before. And I kind of told a very personal generational story about those two women, the first of whom had died of cancer, I think before Dr. Cohen was ever born. And then the answer to explain evolution, I also needed to tell that story through a really fabulous human character. And that person ended up being Dr. Vermeer, near you at UC Davis.
Mhm.
He is the blind evolutionary scientist who came up with the theory of evolution of shells, of marine mollusks, that mollusks build these incredible structures because of an evolutionary arms race. So he was able to show that the rise of predators also gave rise to the extraordinary spines and other pieces of shell that make them able to protect themselves. And his story was so compelling because he had fallen in love with seashells in 4th grade. His teacher had come down, she was down here in Florida on Sanibel Island, and brought back these extraordinary seashells. And to interview Dr. Vermeer there in Sacramento and to hear him describe beautiful things when he is blind is just incredibly moving. And so when I interviewed him, I knew that I could open the evolutionary chapter with him and help tell the story through him and his boyhood, because childhood is also really important in this book, and teachers are very important in this book. So in that chapter, I worked really hard to make sure that his 4th grade teacher is just as important as any PhD scientist in that chapter and in any chapter, because that part of the story and of how we understand the world and how we know science is also really important.
Yeah, I that was another. I mean, the number of characters in the book, and the ways that you describe them will definitely be sticking with me for a long time. And just the dedication, really, that so many of these folks have, in talking with him and his. There were actually not just him, but also Miriam, these stories of them sort of crawling right through lots of
Yes,
spaces.
that's right. That's right. They
Looking-
were both on their hands and knees. That's right.
Yeah, and that is a certain sort of, I don't want to put too much of a spiritual lens on it, but there's a certain amount of really worshipful activity there from these researchers that I found, just as a researcher myself, really beautiful description of how dedicated people can be to the work that they're doing. And sort of speaking of untold stories, I'm wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about another key figure in the book, who is Julia Ellen Rogers, who has some ties to Southern California. And again, is this sort of really fascinating story that relates to kind of what we're talking about with feelings and science. And I was really struck by some of her work being considered too feminine and
Yes.
emotional.
Yes.
And so therefore,
Yeah.
just thinking about how long this whole issue of sort of feeling in science and related to the environment has been something that we've been talking about for so long. And it's still something that, for example, I've had to really fight to write about here, even in 2021 in my own work. So
yes,
I love
than
her story.
100 years,
Yeah.
more than 100 years later.
Yes.
Yeah, her story is probably my favorite story in the book. And at times I thought I might have written the book around her entirely. Unfortunately, there wasn't for me enough information about her to do that. I was able to piece her together much more fully than she had been before. And you just reminded me, Faith, I want to fix her Wikipedia page, which is full of errors. Now that my book is out, I can use it as a reference and go in there and fix it up. And I've got some wonderful pictures of her. So Julia Ellen Rogers, I discovered her because she wrote a really important shell book at the turn to the 20th century. It's called The Shell Book. It's a wonderful book. It was kind of the first really popular American book of shells. And so she had come to Florida. She had been in California. She had been all over the country and in museums and had this wonderful book. And she was an important nature writer in her own right. She also wrote the Tree Book. She wrote many, many books for both children and adults. And I was surprised at how little background information I could find about her, because she was also doing magazine articles at the turn of the century. And I learned after a while why and how her story had been quashed, and it's pretty heinous. So during the Progressive era, starting in the 1890s, she was in a movement that was called the Nature Study Movement. And this came out of Cornell. Faith, and some of you who may know extension history probably know the name of Liberty Hyde Bailey, who is this really important farmer philosopher in the Progressive era. He and a woman at Cornell named she's Anna Botsford Comstock, are bringing nature study to Cornell and bringing it all over the country. So this was the idea that if children grow up, and again, it goes back to school and elementary school, this is really important throughout the book. If children grow up, studying bird eggs hatching and having live frogs and observing snails, and if you live by the sea, going down and seeing sea creatures in the tide pools, they will grow up with a sense of empathy for the earth and a sense of caring for the earth and its life, and taking care of the planet. And this was a really important movement and popular. It was so popular that nature studies were required in public schools across the country in the early years of the 20th century. And what happened, in a nutshell, I won't tell you the whole story, but Julia Ellen Rogers wrote all the nature study curriculum for Iowa. And that state is going to be important when I get to the end of this story. She wrote all the nature study curriculum in Iowa. She was a teacher, and then she left teaching and went to Cornell. She wanted to be a writer. She had the idea for her tree book, and she went to Cornell to work with Liberty Hyde Bailey. And this was popular, as I mentioned, for several years in the first years of the century. And then right around World War I, there is a backlash. And you see this during war, right? There is this backlash against, you're right, Faith, it was almost like maybe too soft or something like that. But there was also a real misogynist sense where some scientists said, this is all too feminine. Children need to learn science from formulas and from, hard science and real science. All of these, bird eggs and mollusks, it's all too soft. They need to read science books, and they need to read science books written by men. There were people saying this, all men scientists saying this. And during the war, nature studies collapses, and it's really gone from the public schools. That wasn't true in California. It does come back in California, and you have, you still have that tradition in the public schools of California. But anyway, it was really hard for me to figure out kind of where she went. And even the wonderful book, Last Child in the Woods, it talks about all those things, but it doesn't go back to the progressive era and that time. And to make a too long story short, there is a researcher at Cornell who has just updated Anna Botsford Comstock's biography. And when she was updating it, Comstock had written her memoirs in like 700 pages. And when it was published by Cornell University Press, it was boiled down to something like 200 pages. Everything about nature study was eliminated. Everything about feelings was eliminated. The whole book ended up focusing on her husband, who was a really important entomologist who built the entomology department at Cornell. So it was pretty much about him and hardly anything about her, and nothing about nature studies. And Julia Ellen Rogers, who had been in the original, was completely left out. So this new biography of Comstock, and the researcher's name is Karen St. Clair, and she's done excellent work kind of bringing this story back to life. But the last thing I'll tell you about Julia Ellen Rogers and the nature study movement, the way to understand the power of what could have been is found in two young children who studied nature study books, and they were Rachel Carson and Aldo Leopold. And specifically, Aldo Leopold was exposed to Julia Ellen Rogers' nature study lessons in his public school education in Iowa, which he even talked about nature study and keeping his logs of birds and so on. So that was a long story, but I wanted to tell you the story, especially since you guys are in Southern California, and Julia Ellen Rogers ends up moving to Long Beach really early, pretty early on, maybe about the 19 teens. And she served on the Long Beach school board for many, many years and brought nature study into the public schools, and also forestry, helped bring forestry and agriculture into the public schools, which I know, Faith, you know something about. And so that's a pretty fascinating piece of California history too.
Yeah, that whole story is just incredibly fascinating to me on many levels, and in so many ways. I think we're still fighting that fight, and it's always interesting to have those kind of archives kind of filled in.
Yes, yes.
And the sense of loss is profound, right?
The sense of loss is profound. When it hit me that both Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson had studied from those books as children, it just is devastating.
Mhm.
It's devastating to know that it was in all the public schools and then it was
Yeah.
lost.
Yeah.
But Faith, let me ask you something about your book, because your book is full of scientists who are allowing themselves to share their emotions with you, or you are pulling those out of scientists. You are revealing the importance of this piece of being a scientist and communicating science. Was it hard for you to find a publisher who was willing? And I will say your book is doing really well. I mean, people all over the country are talking about it. I know it's being taught in science comm classes. Was it difficult to get that out into the world? And I'm also interested in whether it was difficult to convince the scientists to go on the record and be that vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. Actually, I first started contemplating this in about 2008, just based on my own experiences working in a wildfire research center, where even back then, I know this kind of thing is very familiar to people now, but I was just really struck, because I work in a pretty community engaged setting in cooperative extension, by the strong feelings people really had about fire, and there was no outlet for really talking about it. And I felt in the end it was quite detrimental to our work if we couldn't address how people were feeling about fire, which was often traumatized and scared. Some people are excited. And I started publicly speaking about this in about 2009, so about a dozen years ago. And I will say the very first talk I ever gave that talked about this, I think people were a little confused. I had about 10 people come up to me afterward and kind of whisper to me, like, that was really brave.
Right.
And then I just thought, oh no, did I do something wrong? Because that's a strange sort of compliment to get.
Yes.
And so over time, it's become easier, to the point where, when I was finally interviewing people, I was amazed, and I'm incredibly grateful to folks for being so vulnerable with me. And I know many of them have vulnerability hangovers and their own fears about the book coming out. But I also think it was incredibly courageous for people to share with me. When I first started doing the work, I only did it about my own experience, because I didn't want to bring other people into that until they were ready. So it did take about a decade to sort of pave the way for my own ability to talk about my own work in this way. And even earlier today, I gave a talk, and it's a paradigm shift for a lot of scientists. You can see it, even as many of us are feeling it, particularly in the context of climate change, which I think is and the kinds of disasters I work on, drought and fire, just very, very present. And I know for you, hurricanes, right? So we're all kind of dealing with these things right now. To me, there's no way to deny the feeling side at this point. Yeah.
And we know from communication science that on the audience side, the facts and the data and the numbers do not move people to take action whatsoever. They don't move people. They don't convince people of things. They don't make people believe things. It takes some other connection, some other human connection. And this comes up in the research again and again. So for me, you were sort of ahead of that. You were ahead of the curve in starting to talk about feelings. It's not only important as humans, but it's strategically important for telling the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes both ways. Like, I'm pretty clear to tell people I'm not trying to drum up feelings. My feeling is that those things are already there. People have very strong feelings about these things. And so it's more just, how do we acknowledge and kind of work with that, because it exists. And I think ignoring it is pretty detrimental to the work, which leads me into wanting to ask you about, we've talked a bit about this sort of historical aspect of looking at shells, but you also end the book with a sort of more forward looking piece and talk, a lot about climate change and ocean acidification, in particular, the sort of cousin of climate change that's affecting the oceans. And I know it's really, really tricky to write about climate change. So I'm just wondering if how you thought about balancing kind of talking about climate change in the context of, you know, sort of people's love for shells and these long-term stories that you were telling, while also having to sort of talk about what's going on with shells and the creatures that inhabit them and what that means about our future.
Yeah, so that was the difficulty of this work. It's why it took me 6 years. It was an extremely difficult balance. I thought about it constantly. Every waking moment was spent balancing the joy and the absolute devastating story of climate change and what's happening to the world and the seas. It's funny, on one of the reviews came out on Sunday, said I wasn't alarmist enough. It said that nature writers have an obligation to be alarmist. And actually, I think we have an obligation to not be alarmist as much as we want to scream from the treetops and from the warming oceans. Again, we know, because we know from so much data, so much history, that if you are too alarmist, and we see this over and over again, people shut down. They won't finish an article, they won't finish a book. Alarmists are talking to each other right now. So I think we're both on climate Twitter. We kind of call it climate Twitter. There is a climate Twitter out there, and it is full of, it's very, very frightening, because we're all so worried about what's happening in the world, and all these tipping points that we're arriving at. And yet the important thing to remember is the kind of work you do, Faith, that the most important work we can do is to touch people in their communities, and write and speak and tell stories in a way that is super relatable. And that takes a lot of work. It takes, I rewrote so much. I would often write something that turned out to be way too dark. And to be honest, part of it was the presidential administration we were in while I was writing this book. I would be so down, and my writing would show it. And I would have to tear something up and start all over again, because it was just too dark. So for me, it was actually a matter of going back and back and back over the material and balancing the joy and the darkness. But the other piece, especially on the science, is the human ingenuity and the amazing, some of the amazing research that's going on. For example, on alternative biofuels, I went to Palau and reported on giant clams as possible inspirations for algal biofuel, which is, it's just amazing what people are doing with especially some of the biomimicry research that's going on, and how can we use nature to better protect ourselves from hurricanes, from forest fires? How can we go back and see where we went wrong in not listening to Indigenous voices? All of those things are really important. So, but it was a difficult balance. You put your finger on the challenge of this book for sure.
Yeah, it's a tough time to be writing. I feel your pain. I think we were both finishing our books around the same time, where we were trying to write through COVID and
yes,
all sorts of social unrest in this country. And yeah, it shows up. I guess Julie is going to come back, so I'm going to pause for a second. Hello, Julie.
Hello. I think you guys, it's such a fascinating conversation. You could keep going and going. I mean, it's amazing. Love this conversation. But
well,
we have some comments.
And people, I can't recommend Faith's book highly enough. It's getting to the heart of science communication. You can order it through Warwick's or
I just put it on the link.
Okay, great.
you.
Great. Thank
Yeah,
you,
I put
Julie.
both of your books, both of those books are in the comment section.
Okay,
So
excellent.
easy to click
Excellent.
and link on those and order those from us. So we have some good comments and questions coming
Great.
in. That's what I love about this. So Christiana is saying, thank you for hosting this. Can't wait to revel in their wisdom. So we love that. She's coming in from New York City.
I know that, Christiana. Hi, Christiana.
I love it. So Brittany Miller has a question, and she says, hi to both you and Faith. So Cynthia, of the 6 years it took you to finish this book, how much of that was research, how much was writing, and how much was editing? So there's a lot to this question. Where was the coolest place you went for research? She says, P.S. she misses you. And then to both authors, any advice for hopeful future authors? So do you need me to read?
I don't. I wrote that down. And
Perfect.
first I want to say Brittany Miller was a student at the University of Florida College of Journalism, where I teach environmental journalism. And we are so proud of her because she is headed to UC Santa Cruz for her master's degree in science journalism. And this allows me to say, go banana slugs. I believe that Santa Cruz has not the only, but one of the few sports teams named after a mollusk. There is another that I think also may be in Oregon, but Brittany, thank you for being here. And I'm so excited about your future career. And to answer your question, I would say that this is always the case with me. I spend way too much time on the research. I spend way more time than I plan to on the writing, and then I never have enough time for the editing. I thought maybe now I'm writing my 4th book. I'm 55 years old. You would think I saved enough time for the editing, and I did it again. So I would say that the research and the writing were probably 40% and 40%, and the editing was probably 20. And someday I would really love to write something that is exactly equidistant, 33 and 1/3% of each. So Brittany, that is my charge to you in grad school and in your stories. I challenge you to spend 1/3 and 1/3 and 1/3, because I think that last third is probably where something good becomes great. And that's, I really wanted to get there. And I just mess around with the writing so much, or over report, and then I don't get to spend enough time on editing.
What was the coolest place you went to research?
Oh, the coolest place I went to research, that is really hard to say, but I have to say I have a special place in my heart for Ghana. And my son, the very special thing about that trip, we followed the money cowries from the Maldives to Ghana, which was a bit of a crazy trip, but he and I both were just particularly moved to be in West Africa. We loved our trip to Ghana. We felt it an interesting thing about Ghana for us, because we're Southerners. So food we eat that we grew up eating because we have a Southern family, there are certain things we didn't understand had come from West Africa and the enslaved people who had cooked these foods, which include boiled peanuts, which we love at home. And then we were there eating boiled peanuts and everything. Every day, things like that would happen that made us feel so close to Ghana. And we both really want to go back. I actually want to go back and bring my whole family. So that's what I would have to say, Brittany. Thank you for those good questions.
Excellent.
And good luck.
And then yeah, I think you gave her advice for a hopeful future author was the third. Faith, do you have any words of wisdom for a future author?
Well, I would just back up what Cynthia said. I probably only spent a good 10%, if I'm lucky, on the editing piece. I would, if I do write another book, prefer for it to be somewhere around 40%. I am a huge fan of the writer Kiese Layman, and he talks about revision. And so I, like you, think that's where the greatness comes in, and wish I'd understood that from the beginning. And the other thing I think, and Brittany sounds like she's on her way already as a journalism student, but I talk to a lot of scientists about writing, and I really think it just comes down to writing and putting your things out there, because so much of it is getting feedback along the way, and your writing just improves the more that it's out there and the more feedback that you get.
It's so
And
true.
and not being afraid of the criticism that comes.
Oh, for
because
sure.
it's
Yeah.
like that,
And
that's going to come.
Yes.
Yes. And I should say one more thing about editing. I probably am not being fair in saying all that time is spent writing, because the way and this is another piece of advice that I think Brittany has heard me talk about in my class, but I think every writer needs their brain trust. And a group of people who read your writing, no matter how purple or embarrassing it is, you can show those people your writing. And I am super lucky that my husband is a top-notch writer. So my brain trust is the person I live with reads all my writing. And my writing partner is Jack Davis, the environmental historian who won the Pulitzer for the Gulf, and just a beautiful writer. And so they both read my work, sometimes just a paragraph that I'm struggling with, sometimes at the end of a section or at the end of a chapter. So that's sort of my writing process as I go. But I would like to get to the end of the book and then still have that third of the time. That's what I'm going to go for next time.
Because there is something about it, because I think you probably do edit as you go. I mean, there's part of that does happen, but there's something about sitting with it for a while and letting it kind of seep in, and just being able to just really take that. And a lot of times, because of contracts or whatever, you don't really feel like you have that time to let it kind of just machinate in your brain a little
Yes,
bit.
that's when it gets better.
Sure.
That is when it gets better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so Christiana has a question. And it was, I think, having to do with some part of back in the conversation, but I think we'll be able to figure out where we're at with it. Is this feminized science writing? How do you situate Gift from the Sea, which was so autobiographical, and figures in your shell genealogy in some ways? Cynthia, does that make sense?
It's funny, the science goddess interviewed me a few weeks ago on her podcast and asked me if it was a feminist book. I think she asked me, but it might have been her partner who asked me. I can't remember who asked me. I didn't see it as such. A lot of people have been commenting on the feminist angle of the book, but my sense is, if you look at the actual history, if you pick up rocks and seashells that haven't been overturned before, you will find so many women who haven't been in the pages of history. So one thing I love about seashells is that they were the Earth's great fact checkers. That was true for science when they pointed us, they pointed early scientists to evolution and geologic change. It was true in Indigenous history. They spoke to the great cities of shell that rose in Faith's Berkeley and where I am in Florida, that these were not nomadic people who didn't build great structures. And then when it came to the history of women in science, they really tell that history too. Sometimes it would be wives or daughters who were doing all of the scientific illustration, the taxonomy, and so on. We heard the story of Julia Ellen Rogers, other scientists as well. So I'm not sure that it's a feminist book. in terms of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, I am really intrigued by her character. I find her, when you read A Gift from the Sea, it seems very gentle in the Me Too movement. But I think what she said about consumerism and commercialism was just as important as this message she was writing to women in 1950s America when they were feeling, very trapped. And there she gets to go to this wonderful island and be free and walk the beach and have plenty of time to write. And most women would never have that luxury, but she spoke to women and she met this need. It sold millions and millions of copies because women wanted that time alone. And they wanted to hear that they deserved that and they could take that time. But I think what I was more interested in, because I didn't know this until I went back and reread it for this book, she was saying a lot about the rise of consumer culture and the rise of excess. She would talk about the beauty of one shell on a windowsill rather than a windowsill packed with shells. So those are, she had this great subtlety to her writing that, it's just like the person who said I wasn't alarmist enough. It could be that Anne Morrow Lindbergh was too soft for what we knew was coming then, what we knew was building up in that consumer culture. But I found her inspirational, and I find her inspirational. And I think she was important for her time as a writer speaking to other women. I think she's important to our time as a writer speaking to all of us, not necessarily from a feminist lens, but speaking to all people about excess and the desperate need to live differently and live more simply, which is to live better.
Well, and I think you make a great point in that she was writing during that time. And it might not, you have to sometimes take those things in the context of the time period of when they were written. Because if she was more forceful, it may not have resonated as it was intended. You know what I'm trying to say?
Julie, that's a good point. And Faith and I have talked about this before. The other thing we can say is that it's okay for us to all be all different kinds of writers writing to different kinds of audiences, right? And the alarmists on Twitter have really important audiences and followers who they move. I have a different audience. I think of an audience in my mind. I think of an audience that I think of as the caring middle. And I literally think about my grandparents who have passed away now, but they lived in their small house on Marco Island. They loved the ocean. They loved the beach. They would not read a climate change book in 1 million or 2 million years. Well, they would because I wrote it, but normally.
Because you're so right. And I mean, in the book selling business, that's what we're at too. You have this spectrum that you have to have. Because yes, this message is dire and it's over here, but if it's so in your face, there's so many people that aren't even going to take the time to read that.
Yes, but there are people who will, and that
absolutely.
audience,
yes.
Those books are super important.
Absolutely.
And we've seen a lot of great books about what's happening and the tipping points and the tipping points that we're at. There are lots of us out there doing this work. There are lots of audiences, and we've learned that there's no great general audience. There's no such thing. There are different fragmented audiences, and I have my audience in my mind's eye, and you know, if I can hit a larger audience, great, but I sort of have in mind who the seashell book is for.
Well, and also you're hoping that you go a little bit outside of that so that you can change, maybe you can help to change somebody's mind somewhere, you know, to see things a little bit differently. Because we're reading it, you know, so that's, it's amazing.
And Christiana, I want to say too, really quickly, the other thing I have loved that I really didn't expect is the response I've gotten from people. I've had people sending me seashells, and someone sent me an extraordinary jingle shell necklace that they had made, that they collected these jingle shells, I think somewhere in Cape Cod. But someone wrote a note that they were huge shell collectors in the 1950s in this time. And now they're thinking about the world that they have made and inherited. And that was so moving to hear that. And I thought, wow, it's really just great to see how people are responding to it. And if they're shell collectors and that's who I'm reaching, great. I reached some people.
Okay, we'll take one more. This is just a comment, and then I'm going to wrap it up here because we've taken way too much time of your time there. Meryl Utley, hello from South Louisiana here.
Wow, hello, Meryl. So nice to hear from you. So nice to hear from Southern Louisiana.
Yeah, she says here in Timberler Island, the Sargasso weed pile up have killed the shell hunting. She's looking forward to the read, and thanks from your Mardi Gras friends, she says.
Oh my gosh. Well, she is a he, Julie.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But
sorry
that's
about that.
okay.
Sorry,
that's okay. But I just hate to hear about the deaths of the mollusks in Louisiana, and there is an extraordinary amount of loss happening there at the coast where they live. And one thing to think about here is the lives and then the afterlives. So it's the live mollusks. One of the most poignant details in the book to me was this extraordinary alligator effigy in coastal Louisiana that had stood, an alligator effigy made of shells that was torn down to build roads and is now being washed away. And so just so much loss, right? The loss of the live animals, the loss of the indigenous structures, the loss of art. These are all really important things to mourn and to turn around.
Have either of you heard of a book, and it's a novel, and it's a relatively new one called The Council of Animals by Nick McDowell? Have you read it yet?
I haven't read it yet. It's on my list.
You know what? It's great. It's just this little, it's so charmingly clever, but it's just very good. I would highly recommend it. If you're
great.
It's a simple, quick, 180 page book.
I need a simple read now. So that's
and
what
it's
I'm
one
going
of those,
to
and it's,
to.
It's set up as a fable, but it's just brilliantly done. And it, it's The Council of Animals. I think it's Nick McDowell. So anyways, Faith, for people who want to follow you or see more about you, is there a website, or do you do social media, or what's the best way for people to find out more about you?
Sure, you can follow me on Twitter. It's at FR Kearns. That's KEARNS. And I have a website that's just faithkearns.com.
Perfect.
And mine's at Cynthia Barnett on Twitter and cynthiabarnett.net on the internet.
Excellent. This has been a fabulous conversation.
Thank you so much. Faith, thank you for reading so closely, and great to see you. And Julie, thank you so much for hosting us. And thanks to the audience for being here. Hope to see you in person one of these days.
Hope so too. So good night, everybody. And thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.